The first train whistle of autumn echoed through the Black Creek Valley just before sunrise. The station was still wrapped in morning mist. Pine trees stood silent along the hills, their dark outlines barely visible beneath a pale sky waiting for dawn. Long before the first passengers arrived, one man was already standing on the weathered wooden platform. His coat carried the dust of countless roads. His boots looked as though they had forgotten what it meant to rest. Samuel Brooks, the old ticket seller, didn't have to look up from his window to know who it was. Kael Ashcroft, for 3 years, 156 Fridays. Not once had he failed to appear. He always arrived 15 minutes before the morning train. He never hurried, never complained, never asked for anything. He would simply take a worn silver pocket watch from his coat, study its frozen hands for a few quiet seconds, then slip it back into his pocket as though time itself had stopped asking him to move on. Passengers came, passengers left. Life continued around the station. Only Kael remained. Newcomers often leaned towards Sewell's ticket window and lowered their voice. "Who's he waiting for?" Samuel would smile without taking his eyes off the tracks. Some folks spend their lives waiting for a train. Then, after a thoughtful pause, he would add, "But that young man isn't waiting for a train. He's keeping a promise." A distant whistle broke the silence. Steel wheels screamed against the rails as the morning train rolled into Black Creek. The doors opened. A young woman stepped onto the platform, carrying a small leather suitcase. She paused for a moment, taking in the quiet little town, before her eyes settled on the man, standing alone, near the edge of the tracks. She offered him the same warm, polite smile one might give a stranger. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Who are you waiting for?" For a heartbeat. The whole world seemed to fall silent. Kael recognized her the instant he saw her. He had imagined this moment every Friday for 3 long years. But never, not even in his darkest dreams, had he imagined that the woman he loved would return and look at him as though they had never met. Kael didn't answer right away. For a single, fragile moment, the weight of 3 years felt her, then the few steps separating them. She hadn't changed as much as he had feared. Her chestnut hair was still gathered loosely at the back of her neck. Her blue eyes were just as gentle as the ones that had once searched for constellations beside him, on warm summer nights above Black Creek. Only now, there was no recognition in them, no spark, no memory. He swallowed the ache rising in his throat before answering quietly, "Someone who made me a promise." The young woman smiled with simple kindness. "I hope she finds her way back." Then she lifted her small suitcase and walked past him. As she did, something caught the morning light. A silver snowflake pendant rested against her collar. Kael's breath almost wet. Ani had carved it himself during the last winter they had spent together, sitting beside a fire while snow gathered outside the cabin. 3 years had taken almost everything, yet somehow she had never taken it off. From the ticket window, Samuel watched without saying a word. Age had taught him something grief never could. Sometimes the mind lets go long before the heart does. Halfway down the platform, Eleanor slowed, for reasons she couldn't explain. She glanced back, just for a second. The lonely man by the tracks felt strangely familiar, as if she had once left something important behind with him. Then the feeling slipped away, as quietly as it had come. Kael never called her name. He simply closed his hand so tightly around the broken pocket watch in his coat that its sharp edges bit into his palm, welcoming a pain far easier to bear than the silence between them. When the train disappeared beyond the hills, Black Creek Station settled back into its familiar silence. The last footsteps faded, The steam dissolved into the cold morning air. It was as if the town had taken one slow breath and returned to waiting. Inside the ticket office, Samuel Brooks poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself. The other he carried outside and placed on the old wooden bench beside Kael. He had done the same thing every Friday for 3 years. Kael almost never drank it. Still, Samuel brewed it without fail. Some traditions weren't meant to be questioned. They were simply ways of telling another soul, "You're not alone." For a long while, neither man spoke. They watched the empty tracks stretching toward the horizon. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "She's back." Kael kept his eyes on the road where Eleanor had disappeared only minutes before, but not the way you prayed she'd be. A faint smile crossed his face, weary but genuine. "She's alive." He paused. "That's enough." Samuel studied the young man beside him. 3 years ago, he had seen grief in Kael's eyes. Today, he saw something even harder to carry, hope. "You'll still come every Friday?" Samuel asked. Kael nodded without hesitation. "I gave my word." Samuel didn't argue. He was old enough to know that promises were stubborn things. Logic rarely defeated them. Only time ever tried. As Kael finally walked away, Samuel stepped back inside the station. He knelt beside the ticket counter and slid open the bottom drawer. Resting inside was a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of careful hands. He lifted the lid only an inch. His weathered fingers brushed whatever lay inside before closing it again with surprising tenderness. "Not yet," he whispered to the empty room. Outside, another breeze swept across the platform, carrying away the last traces of the morning train. But the little wooden box remained exactly where it was, waiting for the day its secret would matter more than anyone yet realized. Black Creek had only one schoolhouse. It sat on a small rise at the edge of town, built from weathered pine, with a crooked front porch and windows that never seemed to close quite right. The desks had been repaired so many times that no two matched, and every spring the wind found new places to slip through the walls. Still, every morning the room filled with laughter. Within a week, the children adored Eleanor Whitmore. She wasn't the sort of teacher who demanded silence. She told stories instead. She read aloud with warmth in her voice. Most of all, she listened. One morning, a young Apache boy stumbled over a difficult word while reading. A few children giggled before the sound could spread. Eleanor smiled and gently shook her head. "We never laugh at someone who's trying." She looked around the room. "We help them." The laughter disappeared. The little boy whined again. This time, every child waited patiently until he finished. A shy girl walked to Eleanor's desk before recess and placed a tiny wildflower beside her lesson book. "Mr. Kael said you'd like these." Eleanor blinked. "Kael." The girl nodded. "He fixed the school roof last night." Curious, Eleanor stepped outside. Several broken shingles had been replaced with fresh cedar, their pale colors standing out against the older wood. Whoever had repaired them had left before sunrise. No one had seen him. No one had thanked him. Only the clean scent of newly cut cedar remained, drifting gently through the cool autumn air. Eleanor closed her eyes. For an instant, that familiar fragrance stirred something deep inside her, a feeling too faint to become a memory, yet too real to ignore. It wasn't an image, it wasn't a voice, it was simply the quiet certainty that, somehow, she had stood here before. That afternoon, Eleanor found Kael repairing the fence behind the schoolhouse. The children had long since gone home, leaving only the rhythmic tap of his hammer echoing through the crisp autumn air. He worked with the quiet confidence of someone who never rushed and never wasted a movement. As she approached, he drove the last nail into place, straightened his back, and offered a small nod. "Thank you for fixing the roof," she said. He brushed the sawdust from his hands. "The children shouldn't have to worry about rain while they're learning." She smiled. "And what about you?" Kael glanced toward the distant mountains. "I've grown used to the rain." The answer caught her off guard, and she laughed a soft, effortless laugh that seemed to brighten the empty schoolyard. For a moment, Kael forgot to breathe. It was the first time he had heard that laugh in 3 years. He turned away, under the excuse of checking the fence, hiding the emotion that threatened to show on his face. Eleanor noticed a loose nail in the grass and bent to pick it up. "The children say there's nothing in this town you can't fix." Kael looked at the weathered fence stretching into the distance. A faint smile touched his lips. "No. There are some things I can't repair." His voice was so quiet that it almost disappeared with the breeze. She wasn't sure why those words lingered with her. Just then, a cool wind drifted through the cedar trees. The fresh scent stopped her in her tracks. Without warning, fragments flashed across her mind. A warm hand wrapped around hers. A promise spoken beneath an open sky. An old train station, bathed in golden evening light. The images came like reflections on water, and vanished just as quickly. Eleanor lifted a hand to her temple. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I suddenly feel a little dizzy." Before he could think, Kael stepped toward her. Instinct. Nothing more. Then he stopped. Only a single step separated them, so close that he could have reached out and steadied her. So far that it felt impossible. Her breathing slowly returned to normal. The strange feeling faded, leaving only confusion behind. "I'm all right," she said, offering an apologetic smile. Kael nodded, though his heart was still pounding. He almost said her name, but love had already taught him the hardest lesson of all. There are distances no road can measure. Some are made not of miles, but of memories that no longer exist. The following Friday arrived beneath a blanket of silver mist. The railroad tracks disappeared into the morning fog, stretching toward a horizon that seemed to belong more to memory than to the world itself. As always, Samuel Brooks brewed 2 cups of coffee. As always, Kael arrived 15 minutes before the first train. But this Friday was different. I wasn't alone. Eleanor stepped onto the platform carrying no suitcase this time, only a small notebook tucked beneath her arm. She smiled when she saw Samuel. "I hope I'm not disturbing your morning." "Not at all," Samuel replied, hiding a knowing smile. The station's always happier with company. He quietly retreated into the ticket office, leaving the platform to the two of them. For a while, neither spoke. The wind whispered beneath the old wooden roof. A loose rail gave a faint metallic hum. A sparrow landed on the weathered bench before hopping along its cracked boards. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence. "May I ask you something?" Kael turned toward her. "Of course." She hesitated for a moment. "Why do you always come here on Fridays?" His eyes drifted toward the tracks, where the fog slowly dissolved into morning light. If someone once promised they'd come back. He paused, choosing each word with care. Then someone should still be here to keep the promise. Eleanor frowned ever so slightly. She couldn't fully understand what he meant, yet something about those words settled gently inside her, as though they belonged to a conversation she had forgotten, rather than one she had just heard. Before she could ask another question, the distant whistle of the approaching train echoed through the valley. Almost without thinking, her hand reached for the worn wooden armrest of the bench beside her. Her fingers wrapped around its smooth edge. She froze. I don't know why I did that. Kael did, 3 years earlier. Every time the train whistle sounded, Eleanor had reached for that same armrest or rest. She used to laugh and say the sound always startled her. Even when she knew it was coming, she had forgotten the reason. But her hands still remembered. As the train rolled into Black Creek Station, Kael felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Not loud enough to silence the ache in his heart. Just quiet enough to remind him that, perhaps, memory wasn't the only way home. Over the next several days, Kael returned to the school before sunrise. By the time the children arrived, another section of the old fence had been repaired. Broken rails had been replaced. Loose posts stood straight again, and splintered boards quietly disappeared, as though they had never been there. He always came early. He always left before the afternoon lessons ended, like the morning breeze, arriving without announcement, leaving without thanks. One afternoon, however, Eleanor caught him before he could slip away. He was kneeling behind the schoolhouse, fitting a fresh cedar board between two weathered posts. "You always do this alone?" she asked. Kael looked up with a small smile. "If I wait for someone else, the children might have to wait too." Without another word, Eleanor knelt beside him. "I can help." She held the board steady while he reached for his hammer. For a few quiet seconds, they worked without speaking. The only sounds were the soft tap of steel against wood and the wind stirring through the cottonwood trees. As Kael leaned closer to drive the final nail, their shoulders brushed. Barely. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. Yet something inside Eleanor stopped. A warmth spread through her chest, familiar, comforting, impossible to explain. She quickly pulled back. "I'm sorry." Kael looked at her, surprised. "For what?" I don't know." She laughed softly, embarrassed by her own reaction. "I suppose I thought I recognized the feeling." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon sun slipped through the fence, casting long shadows across the grass. Then Eleanor gathered her satchel. "I should get back." "Thank you for helping," Kael said. She smiled. "I didn't do much. You did more than you think." She walked toward the schoolhouse without looking back. Only after she disappeared through the door did Kael sit down on the newly repaired fence. His fingers rested on the smooth cedar rail. For 3 years, every memory between them had felt like a river, too wide to cross. Today, for the briefest moment, it had felt no wider than the space between two shoulders. He closed his eyes, allowing himself that single, fragile comfort before letting it go. A burst of laughter drifted across the playground as a group of children ran past. One little Apache boy stopped beside the fence and looked curiously from Kael to the classroom window. "Mr. Kael." Kael opened his eyes. The boy tilted his head with the innocent honesty only children possess. "Was Miss Eleanor your wife?" The question struck him harder than any blow ever could. For a long moment, Kael simply stared at the boy, unable to find a single word. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the crooked windows of the little schoolhouse, painting warm squares across the wooden floor. The children gathered around Eleanor as she opened a well-worn storybook. "Today," she said with a smile, "I'd like to tell you about a sparrow." The room grew quiet. She spoke of a tiny bird that returned to the same old tree every spring, no matter how long the winter had been or how far it had flown. When she finished, a young Apache boy raised his hand. "What if the tree forgets the bird?" A ripple of laughter spread across the room, but Eleanor didn't laugh. She looked out the window for a long moment, as though searching for an answer she hadn't known she carried. Finally, she smiled. The sparrow would still sing. The children waited. Not because it's trying to make the tree remember. She closed the book gently. But because singing is simply what the sparrow was made to do. Outside, Kael was repairing a broken wagon wheel beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree. The steady rhythm of his hammer stopped. Every word drifted through the open window. Across the schoolyard, Samuel Brooks happened to be delivering the morning mail. He paused beside the gate. Neither man spoke. Neither needed to. They both understood that Eleanor had unknowingly given voice to the very life Kael had been living for the past 3 years. He had never waited at the station to demand that she remember. He had waited because loving her had become as natural as breathing, because keeping his promise was simply who he was. When classes ended that afternoon, Eleanor stepped outside carrying a stack of books. A lone sparrow sat on the weathered bench near the schoolyard. It sang without fear, without hurry, without expecting anything in return. She found herself smiling at the tiny bird, though she couldn't have said why. It lifted into the golden afternoon sky and disappeared beyond the rooftops of Black Creek. That night, beneath the soft glow of an oil lamp, Kael opened the worn leather journal he had carried for years. Most of its pages were blank. He turned to the last entry and, after a long pause, wrote only a single sentence. She still speaks with the same heart. Then he quietly closed the journal, as if those 7 words were enough to carry him through another Friday. A few days later, the children gathered outside the stable for their first riding lesson. The old barn smelled of fresh hay, worn leather, and cedar shavings. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, filling the air with floating specks of golden dust. At the far end of the stall stood Dust. The bay gelding lifted his head as the children entered. Most strangers kept a respectful distance from him. Dust wasn't dangerous. He was simply cautious. Even Kael had needed months to earn the horse's trust. The children admired him from behind the fence, careful not to get too close. Only Eleanor stepped forward. She held out an open hand without thinking, to everyone's surprise. Dust walked straight to her. He lowered his head, then gently pressed his nose into her waiting palm. The children gasped. A little girl clapped her hands. "He likes you." Eleanor laughed. "I think you're right." Across the stable, Kael watched in stunned silence. "No," he said almost to himself. "He remembers you." Eleanor turned. "What did you say?" Kael blinked, as if waking from a dream. A faint smile crossed his face. "I said, he probably smells the apple in your pocket." She looked down in surprise. There actually is one. Pulling a small apple from her coat, she held it up with an embarrassed laugh. "So that's his secret." Kael laughed with her, relieved that she hadn't heard his first words. Dust accepted the apple gently, then stood perfectly still as Eleanor stroked the bridge of his nose. The horse closed his eyes. A low, familiar whinny escaped him. Kael's smile faded. It was the exact sound Dust had made 3 years ago. On the rainy morning Eleanor left Black Creek. The same soft call, the same quiet longing. He turned away before anyone noticed the tears gathering in his eyes. Some memories belonging to people. Others seemed to settle into places he is, and sometimes even into the hearts of animals. Eleanor continued stroking the horse's neck, feeling an unexpected ache she couldn't explain. The stable suddenly felt strangely familiar. She looked into the horse's dark, gentle eyes. Then, without thinking, she whispered, "Dust." The name left her lips as naturally as breathing. She froze. The children hadn't spoken his name. Neither had Kael. She slowly looked up. "How?" Her voice was barely audible. "Did I know that?" A few evenings later, Black Creek gathered in the town square to celebrate the autumn harvest. Lanterns hung from wooden posts, casting warm pools of light across the dusty street. The scent of roasted corn and fresh bread drifted through the cool night air. Children chased one another around the bonfire, while their laughter mingled with the lively notes of a fiddle. The older folks sat on tree chairs, trading stories they had told 100 times before, each one somehow richer with every telling. Samuel Brooks watched it all from the edge of the square. His eyes moved quietly between Kael and Eleanor. They stood only a few yards apart. Not together, not apart, simply sharing the same evening. As the fiddle fell silent, one of the Apache elders stepped toward the fire. Without introduction, he began an ancient song. The melody rose slowly, carried by a voice weathered with age, but steady with conviction. Few outside the tribe had ever heard it. Its words spoke of rivers that remembered the mountains from which they came, and of souls that always found the path home. Kael lowered his eyes, almost without thinking. He began to whistle the familiar tune beneath his breath. Softly, respectfully. Then something unexpected happened. A clear, gentle voice joined the melody. Eleanor. She sang the next verse, as naturally as if she had known it all her life. The square fell silent. The children stopped running. Even the crackling fire seemed to fade beneath the sound of her voice. When the final note drifted into the night, Eleanor covered her mouth in surprise. She looked around, bewildered. I've never heard that song before. The Apache elder smiled with quiet kindness. Perhaps not with your ears. She frowned, still trying to understand. He rested a weathered hand over his heart. But sometimes, the heart learns faster than the mind remembers. No one spoke after that. The fire crackled softly between them. Kael watched Eleanor standing in the lantern light. Her face filled with the same confusion he had seen so many times before. Yet tonight, something else had joined it. A quiet pull, as though some invisible thread was gently leading her toward a place she could not yet name. For the first time in 3 years, Kael allowed himself to believe that memory might not be the only road back. Perhaps there were paths the heart could still recognize, even when the mind had forgotten every step. At the edge of the square, the rumble of wagon wheels broke the stillness. A well-dressed man stepped down from a polished carriage, brushing the dust from his city coat. His eyes searched the crowd. The moment they found Eleanor, the color drained from his face. "Good Lord," he whispered, "it can't be." Jonathan Whitmore had finally arrived. The moment Eleanor saw him, her face brightened. "Father." She hurried across the square and embraced him. Jonathan held her tightly, relief softening the lines that months of worry had carved into his face. "My dear girl, I've missed you." "So have I." For a brief moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Then Jonathan's eyes lifted. They settled on Kael. The warmth in his expression cooled almost imperceptibly. Not curiosity, not surprise. Recognition buried beneath careful restraint. Eleanor noticed the silence. "Oh," she said with an encouraging smile. "Father, this is Kael. He's helped everyone since I arrived." Jonathan stepped forward, extending a perfectly gloved hand. "A pleasure." Kael accepted it. His grip was calm, steady. Neither man looked away. Jonathan spoke politely. "Have we met before?" A heartbeat passed. Kael already knew the answer. He remembered the first time they had stood face to face. He remembered the disagreement, the warning, the promise that followed. But Eleanor was watching them, so he simply replied, "I don't believe we have." The words tasted unfamiliar. It was the first lie he had ever told in her presence. Jonathan released his hand with a courteous nod. Then his gaze drifted almost unnoticed to the silver snowflake pendant resting against Eleanor's dress. His jaw tightened. Only for an instant. A movement so small that no one else would have noticed. No one. Except Samuel Brooks. From across the square, Samuel quietly lowered his coffee cup. He had seen that expression before. It wasn't the face of a father surprised by an old keepsake. It was the face of a man confronted by something he thought had been left behind forever. The laughter around the bonfire continued. The fiddle began another cheerful tune. Yet beneath the warmth of the harvest celebration, something colder had arrived. The past was no longer waiting at the edge of Black Creek. It had walked straight into town. Late that night, after Eleanor had gone to bed, Jonathan sat alone in the small room he had rented above the mercantile. He removed an old leather wallet from the inside pocket of his coat. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then he unfolded a worn photograph whose edges had yellowed with time. It had been torn cleanly down the middle years ago. Jonathan's thumb rested against the missing edge. The half he still carried showed only Eleanor, smiling into the camera. The missing half belonged to Kael. After supper, Eleanor surprised Kael with a simple question. "Would you mind walking with me?" He nodded, and together they followed the narrow path that wound beside the river. The evening sky glowed with shades of amber and violet, while the water carried the last light of day downstream in gentle ripples. They walked without hurry. Neither of them felt the need to fill every silence. The quiet between them was comfortable, as though it had been shared many times before. Eleanor was the first to speak. "Boston is never this peaceful." Kael glanced at her. "I imagine it isn't." She smiled faintly. "The streets are always crowded. Carriages, voices, people rushing from one place to another." She paused, watching a fallen leaf drift across the water. "I used to think I missed the city. And now I'm not so sure." For a while, only the river answered. Then she drew a slow breath. "Sometimes I wake up feeling that I've forgotten someone." Her voice was almost lost beneath the rustling cottonwoods. "I miss that person all day. But I have no idea who they are." Kael stopped walking. The river flowed quietly beside them. He watched its surface instead of her face. "If the day comes when you remember." His words came slowly. "Don't blame yourself for forgetting." Eleanor looked at him with gentle curiosity. "You say that as though it's happened to someone you loved." Kael didn't answer. Instead, he bent down and picked up a single golden cottonwood leaf resting in the grass. Its edges had already begun to curl with autumn. He placed it carefully in her hand. Autumn never apologizes for changing the color of its leaves. She studied the delicate veins running through the leaf. "No. It simply becomes what the season asks of it." His eyes met hers at last. "Perhaps people deserve the same kindness." The evening breeze stirred the riverbank. Eleanor held the leaf for a long time, turning it slowly between her fingers. Something inside her felt lighter. For the first time since returning to Black Creek, the town no longer felt like a place she was visiting. It felt strangely close to home. By the time they reached the boarding house, the porch lamp had already been lit. Jonathan Whitmore stood waiting in its warm circle of light. His expression revealed nothing. He watched Kael offer Eleanor a polite nod before quietly turning toward the road. Only after Kael disappeared into the gathering darkness did Jonathan speak. He asked just one question. "How long have you known that man?" The warmth of the evening seemed to vanish with the words. That evening, Jonathan and Eleanor sat together on the boarding house porch. The town had settled into silence. Lamps glowed softly in distant windows and somewhere beyond the rooftops, A coyote called into the night. Jonathan folded his hands across the top of his walking cane. Kael seems like a decent man. Eleanor nodded. He is. I've noticed how much he helps around town. So have I. Jonathan smiled. The careful smile of a father, choosing his words with precision. Good men deserve respect. He paused before continuing, but people in small towns often mistake kindness for something more. Eleanor looked at him curiously. I don't understand. I simply don't want idle gossip to make life harder for you. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. You're a young woman living far from home. It would be wise to keep a little distance. He never ordered. He never foresaw. He merely planted the quiet seed of caution, trusting it would grow on its own. Eleanor lowered her eyes. I suppose you're right. Across town. Kael sat alone on the station platform. The night train had already passed. The rails shimmered beneath the moonlight, stretching into darkness. As always, Samuel Brooks arrived carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to Kael before taking his usual place beside him. For several minutes, they drank in silence. Finally, Samuel spoke. You could tell her. Kael kept his eyes on the empty tracks. The truth. A faint breeze stirred the brim of his hat. He slowly shook his head. If she remembers, because her own heart leads her there. He wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Then those memories will truly belong to her. He looked down at the reflection of the stars trembling in his coffee. But if she remembers only because I tell her our story. His voice was barely above a whisper. Then she'd be living inside my memories, not her own. Samuel studied the young man beside him for a long while. He finally understood something he had never fully grasped during those 3 long years. Waiting had never been Kael's greatest sacrifice. The harder choice was standing within arm's reach of the woman he loved and remaining silent because her freedom mattered more than his happiness. Far in the distance, the whistle of the night train echoed across the valley. Kael lifted his eyes to the sky. The stars stretched endlessly above Black Creek, unchanged by time, patient beyond measure. For the first time since Eleanor's return, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would stop chasing the past. If she chose him someday, it would not be because of forgotten promises. It would be because she had come to know the man standing before her now. And if that choice never came, he would still be grateful that she had been free to make it. The station fell quiet once more. A new chapter had begun. At first light, the peaceful rhythm of Black Creek was broken by the arrival of an elegant carriage unlike any the town had seen in years. Children stopped playing. Shopkeepers stepped onto their porches. The polished horses came to a halt in front of the boarding house. The man who stepped down was neither a merchant nor a lawman. He was young, impeccably dressed. Every movement carried the confidence of someone raised among Boston's finest families. He introduced himself with measured courtesy. My name is Adrian Beaumont. Inside his leather case rested a small velvet box. Within it lay an engagement ring that had never been given. Morning settled gently over Black Creek, just as it always had. The bakery filled the street with the scent of warm bread. Shopkeepers swept their porches, somewhere near the river. Children laughed on their way to school. Yet the arrival of Adrian Beaumont altered the town's rhythm in ways no one could quite explain. He appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed in a neatly tailored charcoal coat that spoke of Boston without flaunting its wealth. There was nothing arrogant about him. His calm, measured eyes belonged to a man who had spent years weighing every word before speaking it. When Eleanor stepped onto the porch and saw him, surprise softened into a warm smile. Adrian. He returned the smile with quiet relief. I thought you were still in Boston. I was. He paused, as though searching for the simplest way to say what had brought him across half the country. I've come to take you home. There was no demand in his voice, no claim, only quiet certainty. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before nodding gently. I'm glad you came. Across the street, Samuel Brooks watched from inside the station. He had expected to dislike the man before ever meeting him. Instead, he found himself unable to. Adrian's eyes held genuine concern. His smile carried no deception. Samuel sighed to himself. Life had become more complicated than stories usually allowed. There wasn't a villain standing in Black Creek, only another man who cared deeply for the same woman. Beyond the station, Kael was leading Dust back toward the stable after the morning exercise. He slowed when he noticed Eleanor and Adrian talking beneath the porch. Their conversation was quiet, easy. At one point, a breeze lifted a loose strand of Eleanor's hair across her face without hesitation. Adrian reached out and gently tucked it behind her ear, straightening the edge of her scarf with practiced familiarity. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, yet it settled heavily in Kael's chest. He looked away before either of them noticed him. For 3 years, he had believed the greatest test was waiting. Now he discovered there was something harder. Watching someone else offer the simple kindnesses he had once shared so naturally. Dust nudged his shoulder, sensing the stillness in his master. Kael rested a hand against the horse's neck. A question rose quietly inside him, one he had never allowed himself to ask before. If she truly found happiness, did he still have the right to keep waiting for a promise made to another lifetime? The thought lingered long after he disappeared into the stable. On the porch, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his coat. His fingers closed around a small velvet box. He held it for a moment, then slipped it back into his pocket without opening it. Some promise, he knew, could not be offered until the heart was ready to receive them. That afternoon, Jonathan invited Adrian and Eleanor to tea in the small cabin he had rented on the edge of town. Outside, a light breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of cedar and the distant laughter of children leaving the schoolhouse. Inside, the room was warm but strangely quiet. 3 teacups rested on the table. Only one of them was barely touched. Kael wasn't there, yet somehow his presence lingered in nearly every silence. Jonathan carefully set down his cup. Black Creek is only a stop along the way. His voice was gentle, almost conversational. It was never meant to be your home. Eleanor traced the rim of her teacup with her fingertips. So you keep saying. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Or is it that you simply don't want it to become my home? The question settled over the room like falling snow. Jonathan's expression tightened. For the first time since arriving, he had no ready answer. Adrian quietly stepped in before the silence became too heavy. You're still recovering. His tone was calm, reassuring. The doctor always believed that too much strain could. He stopped. Jonathan gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Adrian understood. The unfinished sentence vanished into the quiet. But Eleanor had already seen the exchange. She looked from one man to the other. Neither would meet her eyes. A slow uneasiness settled inside her. What aren't you telling me? Jonathan stared into his tea. Adrian remained still. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. Adrian. Her voice was softer this time. What are you hiding from me? He looked down at his hands, hidden beneath the table. His fingers tightened around the small velvet box he had carried all the way from Boston. The edges pressed into his palm. He had imagined this journey 100 different ways. None of them had prepared him for a woman who smiled at him with affection, yet looked at another town with a longing she couldn't explain. "I promised your father," Adrian said quietly at last, choosing his words with painful care, "that I would help you heal." It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The room grew still again. Eleanor realized something she had never considered before. She had believed she was the only one living with missing memories. Now she understood something far more unsettling. The people who loved her were carrying missing pieces too, not because they had forgotten, because they had chosen not to speak. And sometimes, silence could hide a truth just as completely as memory ever could. Late that afternoon, Eleanor chose the long road home. The path curved past the old cottonwoods before joining the main street. Quieter than the road most townsfolk preferred. Fallen leaves whispered beneath her boots as the sun settled low behind the hills. An elderly wagon driver was tightening the harness on his team when he looked up. His hands froze. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. "Miss Eleanor." The words escaped him before he could stop them. She turned with a polite smile. "Yes." Thomas Reed stared at her face. 3 years had passed, yet he would have recognized her anywhere. Not a single day had gone by without remembering the storm, the overturned carriage, and the terrible silence that followed. He had carried that morning with him like a stone in his pocket. Every day, every season. Were we acquainted?" Eleanor asked gently. Thomas's lips parted. He almost nodded. He almost told her everything. Then, over her shoulder, he saw Jonathan Whitmore walking toward them from across the street. Jonathan's eyes met his. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Thomas lowered his gaze. His shoulders seemed to sag beneath a weight only he could feel. "I'm sorry." His voice was little more than a whisper. "I must have mistaken you for someone else." Eleanor smiled kindly. "It happens." With a small nod, she continued down the road, unaware that the old wagon driver watched until she disappeared around the bend. Only then did Thomas allow himself to sit heavily on the wagon seat. Samuel Brooks approached from the station carrying the evening mail. He had witnessed enough to understand exactly what had happened. "You were going to tell her." Thomas rubbed his weathered hands together. "I was." "What stopped you?" Thomas closed his eyes. "I keep thinking." His voice trembled. "If I tell her the whole truth, I'll only make the poor girl suffer all over again." Samuel followed the railroad tracks, stretching toward the distant horizon. The fading light turned the steel rails into ribbons of gold. "There are truths that hurt." Thomas remained silent. Samuel spoke again, quietly. But silence. He looked toward the road where Eleanor had vanished. Sometimes leaves a deeper wound. The old wagon driver said nothing, because deep inside, he knew Samuel was right. That night, after the town had gone to sleep, Thomas climbed into the loft above his stable. In the corner sat an old cedar chest covered with years of dust. He knelt before it and slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay a single leather rein. One end was blackened and brittle from fire. He picked it up with trembling hands. It was all that remained of the harness from the carriage that had crashed 3 years before. Thomas stared at it for a long time. Then, with a weary sigh, he rose to his feet. He had hidden the truth for as long as he could. Tomorrow, he would finally speak. The first autumn rain arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was pale and clear. The next, thick gray clouds swept over Black Creek, and rain fell in silver sheets across the valley. Eleanor hurried toward the nearest shelter, the station platform. By the time she reached the wooden overhang, Her sleeves were speckled with rain. Kael was already there. He had been watching the tracks when the storm began. Their eyes met for only a moment. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. Together they stood beneath the old roof, listening to rain drum softly against the weathered shingles. The tracks disappeared beneath the curtain of water. The whole world seemed wrapped in quiet. A gust of wind carried cool mist onto the platform. Eleanor wandered toward the old bench that had sat there longer than anyone could remember. Almost absent-mindedly, she brushed her fingertips across its worn wooden surface. The grain felt smooth beneath her hand. Then she paused. Her fingers caught on a shallow carving. Time had nearly erased it. She traced the faded letters slowly. Every. Her voice was barely a whisper. She swallowed. Friday? Behind her, Kael turned. What did you say? She looked at the weathered wood in Canadian. I don't know. A faint crease formed between her brows. I just read it. She continued tracing the nearly invisible letters. Every groove felt strangely familiar, as though her hand already knew where each one belonged. Without warning, pain burst behind her eyes. She gasped. The station dissolved around her. For the briefest instant, she saw another Friday, another rainstorm, a younger man standing before her, a simple silver ring catching the light, his hand holding hers, a promise spoken beneath the shelter of this very roof. The words were almost close enough to hear. Then, everything shattered into silence. The station returned. The rain, the tracks, the bench. Eleanor staggered back, pressing a hand against her temple. A tear slipped down her cheek before she even realized she was crying. She touched her face in surprise. Why? Her voice trembled. Why am I crying? Kael's hands curled into fists inside his coat pockets. Every instinct urged him to step forward, to tell her, to remind her of the promise she herself had carved into that bench on a rainy Friday, 3 years ago. Instead, he stayed where he was. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet. Sometimes, he searched for words gentle enough to carry the truth without revealing it. Our hearts remember things before our minds do. Eleanor looked at him through tear-filled eyes. She didn't understand, yet somehow, his answer comforted her. The rain slowly softened. When it was little more than a mist, she offered him a grateful smile. I should go. Kael nodded. Take care. She disappeared into the gray afternoon, leaving only the fading sound of her footsteps behind. For a long while, Kael remained alone beneath the station roof. Finally, he walked to the old bench. Slowly, almost reverently, he placed his hand upon the exactus where Eleanor's fingers had rested moments before. The shallow carving was nearly invisible now, but he didn't need to read it. He knew every letter by heart, because 3 years earlier, on another rainy Friday, it had been Eleanor who carved those words into the weathered wood, while laughing that promises should be left somewhere. Even time would have to remember. The rain had passed, leaving the station wrapped in the quiet scent of wet cedar and cooling earth. Inside the ticket office, Samuel Brooks stood on a small wooden stool, reaching toward the highest shelf. His fingers closed around an old Yadar box. Carefully, he lifted it down. Dust coated the lid in a thin gray veil. He brushed it away with the sleeve of his coat, revealing the smooth grain beneath. He didn't open it. He simply rested it on the counter and waited. A few minutes later, Kael stepped through the station door. The familiar bell above the frame gave its gentle ring. Samuel nodded toward the box. I was beginning to wonder if today was the day. Kael's eyes settled on it. For a long moment, he didn't move, Samuel slowly pushed the box across the counter. Is it time? Kael reached out, resting his fingertips lightly on the worn wood. The cedar felt warm despite the cool morning. After several seconds, he withdrew his hand. No. Samuel searched his face. Not yet. Kael quietly shook his head. The old station master folded his arms. What are you afraid of? The question lingered between them. Outside, a freight train rumbled somewhere far beyond the hills. Kael looked toward the window before answering. A faint, melancholy smile touched his lips. I'm not afraid she'll never remember me. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. Samuel waited. Kael drew a slow breath. I'm afraid. His words caught for the first time, that she'll remember everything. He looked down at the unopened box and discovered she doesn't love me anymore. Silence filled the station. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed suddenly louder. Samuel had spent 3 years watching the young man return every Friday. He had assumed loneliness was the burden Kael carried, or perhaps grief. Now he realized he had been wrong. Waiting had never frightened him. Being alone had never defeated him. Hope. That was the thing capable of breaking his heart, because hope always carried the possibility of loss. Samuel stepped forward and gently placed a weathered hand on Kael's shoulder. Neither man spoke. Some fears were too honest for comfort. Without another word, Samuel lifted the cedar box once more. He returned it to the high shelf where it had waited for years. Its time had not yet come. As he climbed down from the stool, he glanced toward Kael, who was once again staring out at the empty tracks. A quiet sadness settled over Samuel's face. He spoke so softly that he wasn't sure whether Kael heard him at all. This boy was never afraid of being alone. He looked toward the shelf where the unopened box rested in silence. He was only ever afraid of making the woman he loves carry a burden that should have been his alone. That night, the town lay wrapped in silence. A pale moon hung above the stable as Kael sat alone on an overturned feed bucket. Dust slept peacefully in the stall behind him. The horse's slow breathing, the only sound in the cool autumn air. In his hands rested the old pocket watch. Its hands had not moved in 3 years. He pressed the worn latch and opened it. The familiar click carried him somewhere he had spent every waking hour trying to forget. 1 year after the accident. Boston. The city had felt impossibly large. Its streets were crowded with strangers who hurried past without ever looking up. Carriage wheels rattled across wet cobblestones, while church bells echoed through the gray morning. Kael had searched for weeks before finally finding the hospital where Eleanor was recovering. He waited across the street, not because he was afraid, because he had promised himself he would only approach if she looked happy. The hospital doors finally opened. She stepped outside. Her hair was shorter than he remembered. Her face had grown a little thinner. Yet she smiled at something a nurse had said. It was a peaceful smile, a smile untouched by grief. Kael felt his heart rise and break in the same moment. Before he could stop himself, one word escaped his lips. Eleanor. She turned. Her eyes found him immediately. She looked at him with quiet curiosity, the way anyone might look at a polite stranger, asking for directions. I'm sorry, she said with a gentle smile. Do we know each other? Kael couldn't answer. The world seemed to fall completely silent. A physician stepped out behind her. Dr. Mercer. He studied Kael for only a moment, before understanding everything. Later that afternoon, the two men stood beneath a row of maple trees outside the hospital. Her memories may return. The doctor's voice was calm but firm. Or they may not. Kael stared toward Eleanor's window. There has to be something I can do. There is. Dr. Mercer removed his spectacles and looked him directly in the eye. If you truly love her, He paused. Don't force her to remember. Kael frowned. The mind is trying to heal itself. Forcing it backward may only deepen the wound. He let the words settle. If memories returned, they must return because they're ready, not because someone else demands them. Kael remained standing on the opposite side of the street until evening. He watched Eleanor leave the hospital gardens. He watched her laugh softly with another patient. He watched her disappear inside before the lamps were lit. She never knew he had come. She never knew how close he had stood, or how many times he had almost crossed the street. When darkness finally covered Boston, Kael quietly turned away, not because he had stopped loving her, but because he loved her enough to leave without asking her to choose between the life she remembered and the one she had lost. The memory faded. Kael closed the pocket watch. The stable returned. The moonlight, the smell of hay. Dust shifted quietly in his stall. For 3 years, everyone in Black Creek had believed Kael waited because he couldn't find Eleanor. The truth was far harder. He had found her long ago. And then, he had been the one who walked away. The following morning dawned cool and bright, but the warmth of the sun never quite reached the boarding house. Eleanor found Adrian waiting in the parlor. A single envelope rested on the table between them. Its edges had yellowed with age. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had nearly worn through. Adrian gently slid it toward her. I think this belongs to you. She looked at the familiar handwriting before touching it. My writing. He nodded. You wrote it. More than 3 years ago. Her fingers trembled as she broke the faded seal. The room seemed to disappear while she read. Every line sounded unmistakably like her own voice, warm, hopeful, filled with quiet certainty. She smiled without realizing it. I don't remember writing any of this. Then she reached the middle of the page. Her smile faded. The paper ended abruptly. A jagged tear cut straight through the center of the letter. The next sentence simply wasn't there. She turned the page over. Nothing. Only the rough edge where another piece had once been. Slowly, she looked up. Where is the rest? Adrian didn't answer. Instead, his eyes drifted toward Jonathan. Eleanor followed his gaze. Her father remained standing beside the window, staring out toward the street. His reflection trembled faintly in the glass. Father. Her voice was quiet now. Who tore this letter? Jonathan's shoulders stiffened. The silence that followed was longer than any answer. He neither denied it, nor admitted it. The absence of words became an answer of its own. For the first time since returning to Black Creek, something inside Eleanor shifted. Until now, she had believed her past had simply slipped away. A cruel accident, an empty place in her memory. But this was different. Someone had touched that past. Someone had decided which pieces she was allowed to keep, and which pieces would remain hidden. She carefully folded the letter closed again. It no longer felt like a memory. It felt like evidence. Evidence that the life she could not remember had not only been lost, it had been edited. Outside, the church bell rang the hour. No one in the room moved. No one seemed to know how. Long after the house had fallen silent that evening, Jonathan unlocked the small iron safe tucked behind the wardrobe in his room. Inside rested a bundle of old papers tied with a faded ribbon. His hand lingered before lifting a single torn sheet. Its jagged edge matched the missing portion of Eleanor's letter perfectly. He stared at the familiar handwriting until the words blurred. The tears came quietly, not because he had forgotten what he had done, but because, for the first time in years, he could no longer convince himself that he had done the right thing. Friday came once again. Black Creek Station greeted the morning as it always had. The platform smelled of aged timber and fresh coffee. A thin veil of mist lingered above the rails, waiting for the first train to break its silence. Kael stood in his usual place, hands resting lightly on the head of his walking stick, eyes fixed on the horizon. This was Friday, number 160. He heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, Eleanor was already walking toward him. She wasn't smiling. Not this time. I have a question. Kael's expression softened. I'm listening. She stopped beside the old bench, looking down at the weathered boards where the faded carving still slept beneath years of rain and sun. What if? She hesitated. I've forgotten someone who mattered more than anyone else. The question hung between them. The distant whistle of the approaching train floated across the valley. Eleanor looked up. Would that person hate me? Kael followed the sound of the train without answering immediately. The engine appeared at the far end of the tracks, moving steadily through the morning mist. At last, he spoke. If that person truly loved you, his voice was as calm as the rails stretching before them. The last thing they had ever want, he turned to meet her eyes, would be for you to spend your life feeling guilty. Eleanor lowered her gaze. A strange ache settled deep inside her chest. Not sharp, not sudden, just heavy enough to make breathing difficult. She pressed a hand against her heart, without understanding why. I wish, she whispered. I wish I knew why your words always feel familiar. Kael smiled gently. Perhaps some answers don't arrive all at once. She looked at him again. For a fleeting instant, she felt as though she had stood beside this man on countless Fridays before. The feeling disappeared as quickly as it had come. The train drew closer. Steam rolled across the tracks. Passengers leaned from the windows, eager to see the little frontier town. Then from somewhere beyond the station came the frantic pounding of horse hooves. Samuel stepped out of the ticket office. His face changed instantly. A rider was racing toward them at full speed. Dust exploded beneath the horse's hooves as it charged across the square. Kael. The voice cracked with desperation. Thomas Reed. The old wagon driver barely slowed before pulling hard on the reins. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. Clutched tightly in one trembling hand was a blackened leather rein. I can't keep it hidden anymore. The words echoed across the station. Every conversation stopped. Passengers turned. Samuel's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered against the platform. Jonathan Whitmore spun around. The color drained from his face the instant he recognized the scorched leather in Thomas's hand. For 3 years, the truth had remained buried beneath silence. Now, it had come galloping back, and no one standing on that platform would leave unchanged. Thomas swung down from his horse without a word. He placed the scorched leather rein into Eleanor's trembling hands. She stared at it, her brow slowly knitting in confusion. What is this? Thomas looked at Kael, then at Jonathan. His face had gone pale. For 3 years, he had carried the truth alone. He couldn't carry it another day. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accident. Silence settled over the station. No one spoke. Even the departing train seemed to fade into the distance without a sound. Thomas Reed stood beside his exhausted horse, his chest rising and falling with every breath. In his weathered hand, he still clutched the scorched leather rein he had hidden for 3 long years. Jonathan Whitmore never looked at him. His eyes remained fixed on the worn boards beneath his feet. Not because he didn't know what Thomas was about to say, but because he had spent 3 years fearing this very moment. Thomas drew a slow, unsteady breath. It happened the night Eleanor was supposed to leave Black Creek. Every face turned toward him. You hired me to drive her away before sunrise. Jonathan closed his eyes. I never meant for her to be harmed. Thomas's voice trembled. You said she deserved a life far from here, far from Kael. Rain had poured through the mountain pass that night. The horses panicked. The wagon skidded across the soaked trail before plunging down the hillside. I couldn't stop it. His words broke beneath the weight of memory. When we found her, she was still alive. Dr. Mercer later said the blow to her head had stolen part of her memory. Not all of it. Only the years that had belonged to Kael. Thomas slowly dropped to one knee before Eleanor. His head bowed. I'm sorry. I was too much of a coward to tell the truth. Eleanor didn't answer. She simply looked across the platform at the man who had spent his life protecting her, and the father who had destroyed that life with a single decision. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Whitmore didn't know how to speak to his own daughter. That evening, the station was unusually quiet. The last train had long since disappeared beyond the hills, leaving only the soft hum of crickets drifting through the open windows. Jonathan Whitmore sat alone on the wooden bench inside the station. For the first time in years, there was no authority left in his posture, only exhaustion. Samuel Brooks walked over and placed a steaming cup of coffee beside him. Neither man spoke. The silence between them carried the weight of 3 lost years. At last, Jonathan broke it. I only wanted my daughter to have an easier life. Samuel looked toward the empty tracks stretching into the darkness. They're straight from one end of the valley to the other. He paused. But no railroad has ever been built without crossing a storm. Jonathan let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't the laugh of Black Creek's railroad owner. It was the weary laugh of a father who had finally lost the argument with his own heart. After a long moment, he reached inside his coat. From an inner pocket, he withdrew the remaining half of an old letter. The edges were worn. The fold lines had nearly disappeared. He held it out to Samuel. It belongs to her. Samuel didn't take it. Instead, he gently closed Jonathan's hand around the letter. Some things, he said softly, have to be returned by the ones who chose to keep them. Jonathan lowered his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he knew exactly what he had to do. Tomorrow morning, he would go to Kael, not to stand in his way, but to ask for his forgiveness. Samuel walked to the old wooden cabinet, tucked away in the corner of the station. For 3 years, no one had been allowed to touch what was hidden inside. This time, no one stood in his way. He carefully lifted out a small cedar box and placed it on the table. Its surface was worn smooth with age, but the brass clasp still shone, as though someone had polished it again and again. Eleanor watched in silence as Samuel slowly opened the lid. There were no love letters inside, no wedding ring, no precious keepsakes, only a neat stack of train tickets, 156 of them. Each ticket carried a different date. Every one of them was a Friday. Not a single ticket had ever been used. Eleanor picked up the first one, then another. Finally, she reached for the last. When she turned it over, 3 handwritten words waited on the back. Still waiting. She checked another ticket. The same 3 words, another. Still waiting. Every Friday for 3 years. Kael had written nothing more. No anger, no questions, no desperate pleas for her to return. Just 3 quiet words, written with the patience of a man who had refused to let hope die. A tear slipped onto the faded paper. She couldn't remember a single one of those Fridays, but for the first time, she understood that someone else had lived every one of them, waiting for her. Samuel gently reached into the bottom of the box. There was one ticket, he said softly, that he never put away. He placed it in Eleanor's hand, and the date written across it was today. Late that afternoon, Eleanor found herself walking back to the station. She hadn't meant to return. Somehow, her feet had carried her there as though they remembered a path her mind no longer could. The platform was empty. The last had already disappeared beyond the hills, leaving only the quiet sigh of the wind through the pine trees. At the far end of the platform, the old wooden bench waited beneath the fading light, exactly where it had always been. She sat down without thinking. It was the same place she had chosen every Friday since coming back to Black Creek. At first, she had dismissed it as coincidence. Now she wasn't so sure. Her fingers drifted slowly across the weathered wood, tracing grooves left behind by years of sun, rain, and waiting. Then her hand stopped. There was something beneath the seat. She leaned forward, brushing away a thin layer of dust with the edge of her sleeve. Faint marks began to appear, carved so deeply that even time had failed to erase them completely. The handwriting stole her breath before the words did. It was hers. With trembling fingers, she cleared away the last of the dust. If I'm ever lost. The world around her seemed to fall away. Her heart began to pound for reasons she couldn't explain. She swallowed hard and forced herself to read the rest. Wait for me here every Friday. For a long moment, she simply stared at the words. She couldn't remember the afternoon she had carved them. She couldn't remember laughing beside the man who must have watched her cut each letter into the wood. She couldn't remember making the promise, but solidly. She understood why Kael had never stopped coming. Not because he couldn't let go. Not because he refused to move on. He had waited because she had once asked him to. The truth struck with a force no memory ever had. For 3 years, Kael hadn't been chasing the past. He had been honoring her words, even after she could no longer remember speaking them. A tear slipped onto the faded carving. Then another. Eleanor buried her face in her hands and wept, not because her memories had returned, but because they hadn't. Somewhere in a life she could no longer reach, she had been loved with a faithfulness so complete that it had outlived memory itself. And for the first time since she stepped off that train, she wished she could remember the man who had kept every promise she had forgotten. For a long while, no one moved. The station seemed to be holding its breath with them. Samuel's eyes drifted toward dust, the old chestnut horse standing quietly beneath the cottonwoods. For 3 years, the horse had carried Kael to the station every Friday. It had waited as faithfully as its rider, never once refusing the familiar road. Without a word, Samuel stepped forward and slipped the reins from the hitching post. Dust lifted its head. For a brief moment, it looked at Samuel. Then it walked straight to Eleanor. The horse stopped in front of her and gently lowered its head, as if greeting someone it had known long before today. Eleanor rested a trembling hand against its neck. The warmth beneath her fingertips stirred something deep inside her. Not a memory. Something deeper than that. A feeling of home she could neither explain nor deny. No one asked her to go. Jonathan remained where he was, his eyes shining with regret. Thomas lowered his head. Samuel simply watched. Some journeys have to begin with no one else's permission. Eleanor drew a slow breath and climbed into the saddle. Dust needed no command. It turned toward the road leading out of Black Creek, as though it had traveled that path 156 times before. Beyond the valley, Kael rode alone beneath the fading autumn sky. Golden leaves drifted across the road behind him, carried by a wind that smelled of pine and approaching winter. He never looked back. There was nothing left to wait for. The promise he had made beneath this very sky had finally been kept. She was alive. She was safe. Whether she remembered him or not, that would have to be enough. For the first time in 3 years, Kael allowed himself to ride away from the station without wondering if next Friday might be different. behind him. The steady rhythm of galloping hooves echoed through the valley. He heard it, but he didn't turn. I thought it belongs to another traveler, another story, not his. Then a voice broke across the distance, soft, shaking, almost carried away by the wind. Kael. Everything inside him stopped. No one had spoken his name like that in 3 years. He closed his eyes before slowly turning around. Dust had already come to a halt. Eleanor sat quietly in the saddle, tears glistening on her face as the evening light settled around her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them held 3 years of waiting. Then Eleanor looked at him, with eyes full of sorrow, and something that felt astonishingly close to hope. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I still can't remember you." Her voice broke, but she pressed a hand against her heart. Something in here has never forgotten. Only a few steps separated them now. Neither of them moved. The evening sun stretched their shadows across the quiet road. As though time itself had decided to wait a little longer, Eleanor slowly climbed down from dust. For a long moment, she simply stood there, looking at the man who had loved her through 3 years she could no longer remember. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Kael's eyes never left hers. After a moment, he gently shook his head. "Don't apologize for something you never chose." The words broke whatever strength she had left. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "I don't remember us," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't remember the promises we made. I don't remember falling in love with you." Each confession landed between them, like another goodbye. Kael listened without looking away. When she finished, he smiled. It was the saddest smile Eleanor had ever seen. "I know." There was no disappointment in his voice, no anger, no plea for her to remember. Only the quiet acceptance of a man who had spent 3 years loving someone without asking for anything in return. The silence that followed felt endless. Then Eleanor took one small step forward. She reached for his hand. Her fingers trembled as they slipped into his. "I may never remember who we were," she said softly. "Maybe those memories are gone forever." She looked down at their joined hands before meeting his eyes again. "But every time I'm with you, I like the person I become." A faint smile, fragile as morning light, found its way across her face. "I want to know the man who could wait for someone this long." She paused, not because of who we were. Her grip tightened ever so slightly, but because of who we can still be. Kael closed his eyes. For 3 years, he had waited for memory to bring her home. He finally understood. It wasn't memory that had found him. It was her choice. His fingers loosened. The old silver pocket watch slipped from his hand and fell into the dust. For the first time in 3 years, Kael no longer needed time to keep its promise. A year passed. Black Creek had changed very little. The train whistle still echoed through the valley every morning. Children still raced along the dirt roads after school, and the scent of cedar drifted through the town whenever the afternoon wind came down from the hills. Only the people had changed. The little schoolhouse now wore a new roof, its fresh timber glowing beneath the autumn sun. Outside, laughter filled the yard as Kael knelt beside a group of children, showing them how to shape rough pieces of wood into a simple bench. His hands moved with the quiet patience that had once carried him through 156 Fridays. Now, instead of waiting, they were building. The schoolhouse door opened, and Eleanor stepped outside, carrying a basket of freshly picked apples. She smiled as the children gathered around her, each eager to steal the first crisp bite of the season. Some things had never returned. She still couldn't remember the 3 years that had vanished from her life. Every now and then, usually on quiet autumn afternoons, She would look at Kael with the same curious smile and ask, "Did I always love this season?" Kael would smile back, "More than you know." Then he would tell her another story, not to make her remember, but to give the past a gentle place beside the life they were creating together. As the sun slipped behind the mountains, they walked hand in hand to the old station. They sat on the weathered bench where a promise had once been carved into the wood. They no longer came to wait for a train. They came to watch the sunset. From the ticket window, Samuel Brooks quietly closed the station ledger and looked across the platform with a contented smile. For the first time in years, no one came asking for 2 tickets. Another autumn morning settled gently over Black Creek. The first train whistle drifted across the valley, just as Samuel Brooks unlocked the station doors. By force of habit, his eyes wandered to the far end of the platform, the place where, for 3 long years, one young man had stood every Friday without fail. The platform was empty. Samuel smiled to himself. Not far away, beneath the old cottonwood tree, Kael and Eleanor were repairing the weathered bench together. Time had faded the wood, but not the promise it had once carried. Eleanor brushed a streak of sawdust from Kael's shoulder, and he laughed at something only the 2 of them understood. Nearby, dust slept peacefully beneath the shade, no longer waiting for the familiar journey to the station. A group of children came running across the platform, chasing one another between the tracks. One little boy stopped beside Samuel and looked toward Kael. "Mister," he asked, "doesn't that man wait for the train anymore?" Samuel followed the boy's gaze. For a moment, he said nothing. Then the old station master smiled. "No." His voice was quiet. "He just doesn't have to wait alone anymore." The train rolled into Black Creek with the same whistle that had echoed through the valley every Friday for years. This time, no one turned to watch it arrive. Some journeys were never meant to end at a station. Some were only meant to begin there. Samuel reached into his pocket and took out Kael's old silver pocket watch. The hands were still frozen at 10:15. He looked at it for a long moment before placing it gently inside the cedar box that had guarded so many promises. Then he closed the lid. Outside, Kael reached for Eleanor's hand. She smiled, not because she remembered, because she chose to. The station clock still pointed to 10:15. Samuel had never repaired it. Some clocks are meant to measure time. Others exist to protect a single moment from ever fading away. The camera slowly pulled away from Black Creek. The railroad stretched toward the distant horizon. The train continued on its way. But for the first time in 3 years, no one was left behind. People often said that Kael waited for Eleanor every Friday for 3 years. But that was never the whole story. He wasn't waiting for her memories to return. He was keeping a promise until the day she no longer had to find her way on. Because sometimes, the greatest thing love can do is not bring back the past, but give someone enough peace to begin again.